Hello and welcome to Partially Redacted, a podcast where we discuss privacy and security engineering and related topics. I'm your host, Sean Falconer, and today I'm joined by Lisa Nee and Robert Duffy, and we'll be talking about data deletion and mapping via Data Privacy Vault. Lisa and Robert, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Sean. It's great to be here.
Thanks, Sean. It's great to be here.
Yeah, thanks so much for doing this. I came across this great video, Lisa, that you had created showing how data deletion and mapping works with a data privacy vault. And that made me really want to get you on the show to talk about it. But before we get into all the details there, let's start off with some introductions. Lisa, maybe you can go first. Who are you? What's your background? How do you end up where you are today? And what is your super long job title?
Right, as I explained to you, so my name is Lisa Nee. I'm a practicing lawyer. I've been practicing over 20 years. I trained at two big law firms, Cravath, Swaine and Moore, and Fried Frank, before going in-house. I've worked at big companies like Genentech, Deloitte, Oracle, Accenture, and now I'm at Atos, where I kind of wear three hats. I am a legal advisor with a focus on healthcare, security, and quantum computing. I'm also the compliance officer for the United States, and I am the data privacy legal expert for North America, which is the US and Canada.
And then, Robert, do you mind also introducing yourself? Who are you? What's your background? And how did you get to where you are today?
Sure thing. I'm an attorney with McDermott, Will and Emery, an international law firm. I'm based out of the Washington, D.C. office. I'm in the privacy and cybersecurity group, and I've had a practice focused on cybersecurity for about the past 10 years. I help companies that with through incident response, disputes related to cyber incidents and other cybersecurity issues, and also advise on compliance counseling and legal risk mitigation. I got into cybersecurity by way of e-discovery, so I have a focus on information governance and kind of a general practice that touches on privacy engineering and anything related to software development, systems development, with a focus on information governance.
Awesome. And then, Lisa, we didn't really get a chance to dig into your origin story into privacy. How did you end up, moving into that space and even becoming the compliance officer for the United States?
Sure. So, my I started more as a cyber attorney because when I was at Cravath and at Fried Frank, I supported matters like SCO versus IBM, defending IBM in the open source litigation matter, representing the AMI group in the Napster litigation, and certain technical transactions or matters for my law firm, primarily because I've been coding since I was about 7 years old. I wrote my first brute force attack when I was a teenager, but in that era, when I was growing up in the 80s and 90s, being an engineer really wasn't something that my parents were supportive of. They really were the traditional Korean American doctor, lawyer, accountant. And so I decided to go the lawyer route because for some reason I didn't want to do math. And today here I am doing lots of math. Um, but I wanted to marry kind of both my love for engineering and technology with law in my career, and I've been really fortunate to do that. I kind of jumped into privacy when I left Cravath to go join Genentech. And at that time, HIPAA was really kind of becoming more and more shaped. And, the desk audit was happening. They were, promulgating the de-identification guidance rule. So in many ways, I grew up with HIPAA in the late 2000s or 2008, 2009, while at Genentech. And from there, I joined Deloitte after a negotiation for the SAP implementation agreement where Deloitte was performing services for Genentech. And then at Deloitte, I supported a lot of healthcare clients. And, again, at that time, it was when ICD-10 was coming out. And I don't know if you're familiar with that, but that's the diagnosis code set by the WHO. ICD-11 actually is coming out now, so this is very relevant. And so with that, EHR implementations and upgrades really required a deep understanding of healthcare data. And that's just when, companies like McKesson, Epic were thinking about, not only should we be selling this, electronic health record system and interoperability was coming about, but we should really understand if there's value in this data and how to work with that. And so, working at Accenture and working with those clients and those partners, I got exposed to more and more health data and information. And also around that time, the European Union was coming out. Well, they had come out with their privacy directives and things like that. But I continued that kind of HIPAA focused journey, and I eventually landed at Optiv, which is, well, at the time it was Accenture, and it was just acquired by the Blackstone Group. The Blackstone Group had just finished their portfolio of hospitality companies under the name brand of Marriott. And so now they were doing their portfolio of cybersecurity companies and had acquired Accuvant. And they were looking at companies like Fishnet, their largest competitor, and other pen testing and security services companies. And so I joined Optiv, and that's where I really got deeper into cyber and kind of legal aspects there. I did take a bit of time off for a personal reason, and eventually I went to Oracle Data Cloud after they had acquired BlueKai and Datalogix. And I don't know if you know much about BlueKai or Datalogix, but at the time they were the leading data services platforms. And so, it was that deep advertising insights and getting hash data from one client, putting into a data pool, and matching it against other data clients to find things like, well, the most recent address that you have in your loyalty program for Sean Faulkner may be sfaulkner at Gmail, but actually the most recent one we have through our pool and our information is actually Sean at Gmail. And so doing those sorts of insights and supporting retailers, all sectors in advertising. And that's right when the standard contractual clauses kind of became no longer usable. And so I was on the team at Oracle, getting the implementation for the standard contractual, I'm sorry, for Safe Harbor was invalidated. And so standard contractual clauses were now having to be implemented. And so I worked on the sub-processors and getting those standard contractual clauses in place with Oracle. I eventually left Oracle to join Accenture because, quite honestly, Accenture just seemed like a better environment for me, better pay, more challenges. And I worked in the ecosystem side and the subcontractors because of that background with processors. Eventually, after supporting a lot of initiatives within Accenture, I ended up in the global data privacy team doing strategic initiatives. And that included doing assessments of 10 different countries, helping the organization become HIPAA compliant. And so that's kind of been my background in privacy. And here I am today at Atos, and working sometimes with Rob, sometimes not, on certain issues that, of course, we can't talk about. But one thing I did want to add about Rob that he's so humble about is the reason that I love working with Rob Duffy from McDermott is there are very few attorneys out there who have a technical background, and Rob actually has a degree in computer science. He's actually worked as a full stack uh, developer. And so what I love about Rob is he can read a forensic report like nobody's business very quickly, and he can speak to it in plain English so that attorneys that don't have that engineering background, he can actually tell them what it says. So sorry, little blurb for you, Rob.
Yeah, that's awesome. I mean, I think that's a really powerful combination and very increasingly relevant to have sort of that combination of skill set of a computer science background or an engineering background. Even you had talked about learning to code as a child, and then also then understanding the law side of everything is a great combination to move into privacy. You mentioned ICD-10, ICD-11. I'm very familiar with those. My postdoc research, I worked with the World Health Organization on redesigning the tooling around developing ICD-11. So it's funny to hear that come up now, like more than a decade later. So both of you have incredible breadth of experience, been working in the privacy space for a long time, and I feel like even though I haven't worked in the space nearly as long, I feel like there's been a real momentum shift when we're talking about privacy and sort of acknowledging what's going on, increasing of privacy laws and regulations, and then of course news around companies that are in violation of those things and the various data breach news that we see all the time. Maybe to start off with, and we can maybe Robert, you can take this one to start. Why do you think 2023 essentially is the year of privacy?
That's a great question. There's a lot of momentum around it, both from uh, the consumer perspective. There's a lot of people talking about it, and that's driving a lot of attention from regulators and the other stakeholders there. And there's also a convergence of privacy focused technologies that are driving privacy engineering work and are driving companies to think about not just what data they have, but how can they really optimize their business processes around uh, having maximizing their um, efficiency around data collection and use, and reducing their risk at the same time. And the privacy vault that Lisa loves to talk about is something that's a key part of that.
Lisa, do you have anything to add around what Robert said regarding basically the time is now for privacy?
Yeah, I think it's there's a couple other things, with all the privacy laws that are coming into effect in 2023. So of course now organizations have to make it a priority. But even with that, as the internet has evolved, right? Like privacy isn't something brand new. And if you think about it, like think about Pamela Lee and her sex tape video, that was 1995. And if it wasn't Pamela Lee, and let's say it was someone like Mother Teresa, right? Then people would be freaking out that her privacy is being invaded. But in 95, it was like, well, Tommy Lee's cool and Pamela, you're just, they basically slut shamed her. And now we look to 2022, 2023, and I think people have more sympathy for Pamela Lee to the point where even Netflix has a video about that and they're talking about that. And Netflix, I've been Netflix binging like crazy, just like everyone else during COVID. But they've had some really interesting documentaries about not only Pamela Lee's and Tommy Lee's video being stolen and that whole privacy invasion, but there's a Netflix documentary that I've been talking about called The Most Hated Man on the Internet, where he basically stole or hacked into people's Gmail's account, got private pictures, and then posted it on like a revenge porn site, and how it took a mother years before the FBI and police would come in and help take down pictures of her naked daughter who was a minor. And people that's like the 2000s, and it's not until now when people are annoyed with ads and people are starting to realize like, oh my gosh, the internet is free. But it's not really free. There is a consequence. And I think because of that, our culture has come to this convergence that, hey, maybe privacy is really important. And the United States has typically been, and I don't mean to stereotype, but even with HIPAA isn't a privacy law. It was there because of Medicare fraud, right? It was all about capitalism and finances, and making sure the data was right so that when an insurance company paid a claim, it was appropriate. So that when people were going between jobs, healthcare costs weren't being unpaid and bills not paid. It's a very capitalistic society. And now today, privacy has become important, not just because of a privacy right like Pamela Lee from 1995, but from a capitalism right, with all these internet companies, advertising companies being impacted, and all this international data transfer. And then you add on top of that all the anti-terrorism and surveillance information that's been revealed, not only with Edward Snowden, but that I forgot her name, but that woman in the UK who exposed how the UK intelligence agency was actually monitoring conversations between, nation state actor representatives who were at hotels in the UK. I'm gonna have to Google that.
Yeah, I think you raised a really good point about the essentially this video that came out from, or like the stolen video of Pamela Anderson, and you see that similar with celebrities that have text messages stolen or something like that, which you perceive essentially as your private communication. And if you're a technical person, maybe you're like, well, if it's on a device, it's not really private. Someone can always get access to it, but it's like still someone is stealing that information. But it's the fact that they happen to be a celebrity that kind of people like
Yeah, they think
laugh at it.
celebrities don't get privacy.
Yeah.
And there's that whole Harry and Meghan Markle. There was George Clooney when he had the motorcycle accident, and the nurses at UCLA were like, "Oh my God, George Clooney's here!" But it's like he's a patient. He's not just George Clooney. And the major HIPAA violation and fines that the UCLA Medical Center had to pay because their nurses got so excited that it was a celebrity.
Yeah. So I think I totally agree. I think there's a clear ramp up and visibility around these issues and people becoming more aware of it. I can even remember, and I mentioned this before on the show, like when I was in graduate school, now over 10 years ago, like back then, even people were talking about that was sort of the heyday of Facebook and so on, and a lot of the early like social media platforms. Like people talking about this is the end of privacy essentially. Like everything's just going to exist online. But there's been a huge transformation, and I think education that has happened since then. And you also mentioned this concept of like it's free, but it's not really free. And I think people have a better understanding of what they're giving up by using some of these products. Now, a big challenge that a lot of I think companies have. And struggle to navigate is around like actually deletion of information. So even if they are prioritizing this, they are still going to face a lot of challenges around someone coming and saying like, "Hey, can you delete my information?" Can we talk a little bit about first of all, what laws are there out there that actually require deletion of data from like essentially a user of that company can come and say like, "Hey, can you delete my information?"
I'll take that. So there's one of the first laws that established this right is the GDPR, and that's been around for quite some time. But there are a number of laws that are popping up in the U.S. So the CCPA came online about a little over 2 years ago, and it allowed California residents to request the deletion of their data. At this point, there are several state laws that allow it, including Virginia and Colorado, and there's more being announced every day. It's spreading, not just in the U.S. and the GDPR in the EU, but across many jurisdictions. China's got one, Brazil, to the point where the majority of companies are just offering it outright to anyone, regardless of what jurisdiction that they're in.
And why is it a difficult problem for companies to actually delete someone's information?
I think Rob can talk about that. I know he had an experience with a client that can't be named, where he was kind of surprised at some promises a vendor had made. Do you want to take that, Rob?
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, just the challenge here is simply that these data subject rights are kind of forcing companies to think for the first time about where is my data really, and you've got companies with years and decades worth of technology that isn't built on, let's say, good hygiene of knowing where your data is, and making sure that you're collecting only the data you really need, and everything. And so it's just it takes a lot of work to get your hands around the legacy systems. I think a lot of companies, when they're bringing new systems online, new applications, new business processes, they're being very thoughtful about what's involved, and how the data is being used and where the data is. But so many companies just have just a tremendous amount of legacy information and systems, and it's really a black box when you get above the kind of the level of the developers and sysadmins that are actually hands-on in on the systems. And there's a number of tools that are popping up, and that are trying to make the process easy, and to a mixed degree of success. I think at the end of the day, a lot of companies had to do a lot of work in manual data mapping work to get to the point where they could defensibly fulfill a deletion or a data access request. And the question, it's a question of whether how many companies out there actually can truly find and delete your data if you ask them to.
Hey there, Sean, host of Partially Redacted. You probably guessed that since at this point in the interview you probably recognize my voice. I've been told for years that I have a face for podcasting, but no one has mentioned whether I have a voice for podcasting, so sorry about that. Hopefully, the awesome guest makes up for it. Anyway, if you're enjoying this episode, please support the show by subscribing and telling your friends. You can also join the Partially Redacted community at skyflow.com/community. Okay, that's enough for me. Back to the show.
Yeah. I actually heard a story recently about from a company that I talked to that it costs them somewhere between $5,000 and $10,000 every time to delete someone's information, because essentially they have to pay someone, an engineer within the company, to go and like track down all those locations, like the backups and all the maybe a log file or all the various systems, multiple databases, probably data warehouse, data lake, or downstream services. So do you think, in your opinion, that like one of the big like fundamental problems that is making it challenging for these businesses, especially the ones that have been around for a long time, that have like built things without really thinking about this as a problem, it's essentially the fundamental issues of PII sprawl problem?
If I could take that. So, last year I took time off from being a lawyer to be a privacy engineering consultant at a consulting firm. And that's when I was really evangelizing data vaults, because ultimately, and it was really perfect timing, because in November, when the legislator in California was unable to extend the exemption to employee data, that meant that CPRA would now apply to employee data. I'm just going to park that and remind people, think of all the layoffs that have been happening in the most recent months, and all those California, former employees who have been trained on data and CPRA because they worked at big data companies, what they could potentially do to get back at, quote unquote, their employers. But with that aside, the challenges that I've seen is that a lot of companies and organizations and privacy professionals believe that they have a data map because they have a record of processing, right, which is required under GDPR. But a record of processing is not a data map. You don't know it's on X's laptop. You don't know it's on this hard drive or this rack or this server. And and then if you think about it, not all e-data can just be easily erased. And I think Rob can talk about this, right? Sometimes you have to literally pulverize the device or the hard drive, because there's like that phantom copy for the S drive or SSD drive. Does that sound right, Rob? What I'm talking about with the he's like laughing at me.
Orphan files, maybe you're talking about.
Yeah, so I mean, you don't really have a guarantee that you've deleted the files, even if you've figured out like, oh, it's on this person's laptop. And what's really interesting is more recently, there's been discussions about a new form of data architecture. And this is part of the privacy enhancing technology called data mesh, right? And that's where instead of having like CIO be in charge of all the technology and all of that, but actually having the domain owners be responsible, because they're the ones that are going to know the use case. And part of that responsibility will be knowing who has access to the data, who's being given the data, and because of that, they'll know whose laptop the data is. So if you take together, you take together the ability to delete, and you have a domain owner who knows where things are, that can help solve the problem. But again, to Rob's point, we're talking about legacy systems and data that has been residing who knows where and been floating around and shared for decades. So even if you do move to a data architecture that's going to be a data mesh architecture, you still have this problem of old data, phantom files, and SSD drives. And that's why data vaults are so important, because they can actually help you find those things that a human being or that an engineer didn't find, not because they're not qualified, but because they didn't know. And especially unstructured data. Like, let's not even, oh my God, that's a whole other animal.
Yeah, I think you raise a really good point. This is something that I've talked about it in various talks before as well. And I think anybody with kind of an engineering background, like in principle, understands this. Like, deletion of data is a tricky thing. Like, it doesn't most deletion isn't really deletion. Like it doesn't actually go away. There's either ways of recovering it, or it's basically marked for deletion, and then it's going to stay somewhere, and it never actually gets deleted. It's just kind of hidden, essentially. So navigating all that and really understanding at a fundamental level what it means to delete data, especially subject to these various laws, is a difficult thing for most companies to navigate. I want to get into talking about this concept of a data vault, but maybe before we get there, I have one more question just in regards to deletion. What is actually the cost of a violation if someone doesn't delete someone's data? And I'm sure that varies a little bit based on the law, but can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, the potential risks there are huge. The CCPA has a very poorly defined um, statutory damages of $750 per violation. And does that mean, per individual record per day, or there's some, there's a leeway there for the CCPA, the California Privacy Protection Agency, to interpret that in a way that, they could easily be looking to fine a regular medium-sized business millions and millions of dollars. And we have seen a $1 million violation, not for necessarily lack of data deletion, but from that agency against an online retailer for not having an opt out. So I mean, I think I think companies should plan that violations or being unable to defensively delete data could lead to significant fines.
And even on top of deletion, I know we're talking about deletion, but think about from a legal department when you have a legal hold, or you have an agreement, or you're having discussions, and sometimes you'll have in your NDA that once the discussions are over, you have to delete the files. So we're not just talking about privacy laws, but there are existing requirements contractually, like in the NDAs, that say you will delete everything once we're done with our discussions, especially in the JV, joint venture, private equity space, right? You've already got problems talking about residual information, but you have to certify that all the data and information that you've discussed for, let's say, a joint venture has been deleted. How are you going to be able to 100% know that it's been deleted, especially when we've got redundancy, geo redundancies? Someone may delete it from their Outlook, but that doesn't mean it's not sitting on some server. So you could be violating that contract, right? And then when you have a legal hold and you're supposed to find certain documents, how are you going to find the documents? Not delete it, but literally find it so that someone doesn't delete it. So I think vaults get into a bigger picture than just deletion.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I think that's a great. You set me up well for this transition to get into what is a data privacy vault, and where did you first learn about this concept, Lisa?
So I have a couple privacy heroes, and my privacy hero, one of them is Yuta Williams. She's at Reddit right now. She's worked at large organizations like Google, and she is just one of the most amazing, fantastic people that I've ever learned from. She graduated from Carnegie Mellon. She's an intellectual. She's a practical privacy engineer, and she was actually the one that told me about Skyflow and privacy vaults. And that's how I learned about your company and what they could do. And the reason that I tended towards companies like yours is there are many companies out there that are claiming that they can do what a privacy vault is, which is, help you find the data, classify it, whatever. But what I really liked about your organization compared to others was so many others claim that they can manage unstructured data, which is kind of laughable. You may know about data leakage, and the most famous story that I know about is Anne Hathaway and Berkshire Hathaway. Berkshire Hathaway had an algorithm to figure out what kind of things were triggering. I think their their stock price or their investments to go up. And so they had an algorithm that would look for the word Hathaway. And every time an Anne Hathaway movie came out, for some reason, that algorithm said, this is the time Berkshire Hathaway is great. Until someone figured out, oh my God, they're talking about Anne Hathaway and not Berkshire Hathaway. And so there was that confusion. And so that Hathaway problem is the deal with unstructured data, right? When you need to find data, and let's say you need to find the data of David Jones, right? Someone could have written it down as Dave Jones or D Jones, and that's the unstructured data part, the free text. And your organization has been very, very clear, very transparent, and very trustworthy by saying, look, there are problems with unstructured data that, that need extra effort. Whereas most organizations say, oh, we can do it all. We can do structured and unstructured data. And to me, that's what really sets your organization and your products ahead, is that you actually are thoughtful enough to understand data to the point where you're honest with your consumers and your clients, saying that we're not going to lie and tell you we're the one fixed solution. We actually understand data, and this is something you need to be aware of. So that's how I learned about your company, and why I really thought Skyflow was one of the better companies when it came to privacy vaults or data vaults.
Awesome. That's great to hear. And I think, the things that you talked about was this understanding of data. And I think if you look at sort of the founders and the leadership team of Skyflow, we're not really, we didn't come from necessarily cybersecurity background, although we have a lot of people with deep expertise in security and, of course, privacy. But a lot of the leadership team and the founding team they have deep expertise in data, from companies like Salesforce and Microsoft and Oracle and so forth. And I think that is the lens that they're taking and looking at this so they understand the challenges around data deletion, PII sprawl, from working in these massive organizations where they face those challenges themselves and had to try to design products to essentially solve those problems at scale.
Yeah, you've actually worked with data and hit your head. And you've also, everyone on this call, I'm sure will agree, retention is the redheaded child of cybersecurity, right? Nobody really pays attention to it. They instead pay more attention to access management and things like that.
Great. So we've been talking about, the challenges around data deletion. So maybe we can touch on getting into a little bit more of the details of how does the data privacy vault essentially help address the deletion problem. And then we can also go from maybe beyond that, as you mentioned, it helps solve other problems as well, even though we're kind of focusing this conversation around deletion.
So my understanding of a privacy vault is, and the way that I've done it in my illustration, and it's very high level overview. There's that video that I shared, but there's also the article in IEEE that I co-authored. But you basically can run a pipe, right, to a staging area where you get the data ready to be looked at by your vault. And then you throw that data into the vault, and you apply some technical policies to say things like, hey, go find everything about Faulkner, Sean Faulkner, S. Faulkner, head of development, whatnot. And then the vault can actually classify and tag the data. And then you can decide what you need to do with it. Do you need to just delete it? Or do you need to set it aside for a legal hold? Or do you run it back to your system so that if Sean ever does want to delete it, you end up actually being able to find it? I believe it's kind of like putting a homing pigeon or like a bug on data, which kind of sounds stalkerish, but it's not. It's like something that you need, right? Because privacy, quite honestly, from a human rights perspective, I think is about regret, right? The reason you want it deleted is because you regret what you said, or you regret what's being said, or whatnot. And so you really need to know, where is that data? Where is my video, my sex tape? So I can get rid of it.
And then, Robert, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, the privacy vault, really helps with identifying, where your data is, keeping it in one place. And, it's just really it can be a foundational part of good data hygiene, which is in turn, a foundational aspect to, every privacy framework, cybersecurity regulation, and Lisa, as Lisa said, retention is the redheaded stepchild of cybersecurity. I mean, as someone that has been working on incident response and data breach cases for more than 10 years now, it's every case has so much data that should have been deleted, that no one knew was there. I think a privacy vault is part of a well-balanced breakfast of data hygiene that can really make the difference for a company that wants to have a mature approach to information governance.
And if I could add to that, because of this whole movement about cookies and tracking data, right? A lot of times the data is there because, let's admit it, the people in marketing or whomever are like, we don't want to get rid of it because we want to use it. And you ask them for what? And they're like, we're not sure yet. So until then, please don't delete it, right? And so they try to hold on to it forever. And then legal's like, look, there's this, you can't keep it. And so there seems to be this internal struggle, but there really isn't. It's okay to delete the data. What the marketers want is the utility of the data, right? The information in the data. So the way that I've always juxtaposed data vaults is you kind of combine it with the creation of synthetic data. So once you find all the data that has that utility, you can create synthetic versions of it. And the story that I tell, again, is and I have to give shout out to Robert Ham from Infosys, because he helped me kind of communicate this best. But, synthetic data is kind of like James Bond. He's played by Sean Connery, and he's also played by Daniel Craig. Sean Connery can't claim to be Daniel Craig, and Daniel Craig can't claim to be Sean Connery, but both can claim to be James Bond, and we're trying to sell bulletproof vests to James Bond. So if you pull and extract the utility out of the data and create a synthetic version, right, then you can delete the data and still have the utility, and now legal's happy, marketing's happy, CISO is excited because this is fake data, so he doesn't care if there's a leak, right? The only one that really cares is finance, because to them it's an asset now, the synthetic data. Privacy doesn't care because, again, you have a record that you deleted the data. The data is not really personally identifiable because it's an aggregated set. It's almost pseudonymized, right? And the company should be excited because they have this new asset. And the only way to do it really well is to combine not only synthetic data, but with a data vault to actually find the data that has the utility that the people that want to hold on to it want so badly in order to prevent the deletion and to go against the retention policies. And to Rob's point, there's been all this litigation more recently where people have been fined by the FTC, like Cafe Press, not only for having an incident, but they had an incident that involved data that should have been deleted. So think about it. Incidents are going to happen, and anyone that tells you that it's not, I think, is being naive. So you might as well be very careful and start deleting that now before that incident happens, and you get tagged not only for an incident, but also an incident involving data that shouldn't have existed in the first place.
Yeah, I think you made a lot of really great points there. I think you're right that basically any system can be penetrated and compromised, and you essentially have to assume that can happen if somebody is determined enough. But you do have control over what is the impact of that if that does happen, and also how fast can you react to it and so forth by setting up the correct policies, and also essentially looking at what data you're actually holding on to, who has access to it, and so forth. And you're right, a lot of times I think historically we've convinced ourselves that we need to give people access to certain level of data in order to perform their job, when in reality what they want is to be able to perform assertions on the data. Essentially it's the data utility. I want to know, how many people or, what percentage of the population of my users live in a particular state or a particular country. Well, I don't need actually access to all the customer records and names and so forth to answer an assertion like that. And there's all this now, innovation that's going on in privacy enhancing technology and encryption, around zero knowledge proofs and so forth, that allow you to get access to the utility of the data without actually exposing the underlying data. So,
If you
Right.
think about it on an economic scale, if you do couple a data vault with a synthetic vault or synthetic data and you create synthetic data, that data can pay for your vault, right? Because now you've created an asset of information and utility that companies want that you can license. And then that license fee that you're collecting could pay back the cost for a data vault. And then, you spoke about fines before, right? CPRA has a $7,500 per intentional, 2,500 for unintentional. You've got Virginia with the 7,500 per violation. Colorado is the one that scares me the most because a violation apparently constitutes a deceptive trade practice. And once you're tagged as having performed a deceptive trade practice, that's going to bring all the other states, all of whom have deceptive trade practices, and then the FTC knocking on your front door. So how do you mitigate that? This is, and I know people say risk, mitigate risk, mitigate risk, but it's not a risk, it's an investment. It truly is, because you're creating an asset and you're actually being proactive about, your defensibility when it comes to a deceptive practice or holding on to data too long.
Yeah, absolutely. And we touched on it. Robert, you talked about this earlier around the sort of fundamental challenge that a lot of these companies have is essentially this PII sprawl problem. And the nature of the data privacy vault is you're essentially you're stopping that sprawl problem by creating this, isolated single source of truth of actual PII data. And then you're using references to the original data that you can, copy till your heart's consent, because it's not the actual data. It's like a de-identified version of it, like a pointer in programming. And that helps address, or that makes deletion much simpler, because you're basically just going to that single source of truth to delete. What other, maybe we can, as we start to wrap up here, what other challenges that you're seeing in the privacy space does the data privacy vault beyond deletion help enable and enable a business actually solve for?
Sure. I mean, there's, the obvious parallel will be, data access requests, and data opt-out requests. But it also helps with records retention, and legal hold, and it can, if it's integrated with your contracting and procurement workflows, and if you're someone who's actually getting data from licensing data, having this sort of like single source of data where you can sort of tag what your rights are in it, is something that I've seen companies use to really unlock the value of their data.
And I need to give Rob some credit because he may have forgotten this conversation we had because sometimes he lets me geek out with him. So it's related actually to the threat of quantum computing, right? Quantum computing is happening, it's going to happen. And when a threat actor has access to a quantum computer, traditional encryption is going to be useless, right? And so that's why the world is racing towards trying to find, quantum resistance. But if you think about it, there's been a lot of breach incidents where where the data's been encrypted, so they think, oh, it's safe, or there's no evidence that it's on the dark web, so it must not be in play. But what Rob pointed out to me was the whole concept of store now, decrypt later, right? So if you have a data vault and you know where your data was, and you know that there was an incident, and even if you have no signs that the data was was on the dark web, or even if the data was encrypted, you can go back to your data vault and your data maps, as quantum approaches, to see, is there data that's at risk for store, is it steal now, Rob, or store now, decrypt later?
Yeah, both of those work.
Okay.
It's not trademarked.
Yeah.
Awesome. And then, beyond the data privacy vault and a lot of the stuff that we talked about, are there other like tools and technologies that you're seeing or that might be coming out in the next few years that you're really excited about?
I mean, I think there's a whole class of tools that are, that are going out there and finding the data, and helping companies manage their workflows around that, and whether it's, they're looking for data in a traditional sort of relational database, or some, in a more unstructured format, or they're actually looking at data in transit. And there's some tools that are better than others in this space, but I think with some of there's a convergence with these tools that in the advances that we're seeing in the AI space, that I think are, I'm cautiously optimistic that in the next few years we'll be seeing much more powerful tools that can help companies with their information governance challenges.
For me, like, yeah, for me, like I said, synthetic data is something that's been really exciting for me for a few years. And what's more exciting is that, most people didn't really think synthetic data would be that useful because, it's like 40, 50% accurate, and like you can't use it in healthcare because, people will die. But MIT actually came out with a research article saying that synthetic data actually trains machine learning better than real data. So again, if you combine data vaults with synthetic data, you can find the utility that you want, create a synthetic version of it, pay off your data vault, have a new asset, and the having data assets remains important despite all these risks of fines and things like that. Because look at the way technology is going. We are literally going faster, right? Quantum computing, 5G, the metaverse collecting so much data because it has to. So if it's so much more critical now with these other technologies that's happening, that's pushing innovation to be faster, 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 more data, more data, more data, that you have things like data vaults. And again, synthetic data to help pay off your data vault.
Awesome. I think that's a great place to leave it. Lisa and Robert, thanks so much for being here. I really, really enjoyed our conversation. I love that more and more people are championing the idea of using a data privacy vault, for securing and using sensitive data. I think you made a lot of great points. It's also really great to hear your perspective on this from essentially more the legal side of things. So thanks again for being here, and cheers.
And remember, it's not legal advice.
It's not legal.
Go talk to your lawyer.
Thanks for having me, and be sure to get a second opinion.
Yeah.